his response.
When they fired against us, we replied, but after a great restraint, and thousands of people were killed too. They weren't killed in a concentrated manner, so what? Doesn't matter.
We've already gone well past our closing time. I mean, Mr. Prime Minister, with apologies to Prime Minister Erdogan.
1 minute. 1 minute. 1 minute.
Well, you know.
1 minute. 1 minute.
Okay.
The last person who is speaking, the Israeli President, Shimon Peres. In Iraq, the State Department is searching for a replacement to the private military company Blackwater Worldwide. Iraq announced this week it won't renew Blackwater's license to guard U.S. personnel and installations. The U.S. says it'll comply with the order and has already spoken to the companies DynCorp International and Triple Canopy. 5 Blackwater guards were charged last month for the September 2007 mass shootings of 17 unarmed civilians in Baghdad's Nisour Square. In France, more than 1 million workers took to the streets nationwide in a general strike against the French government's response to the global financial crisis. The strike was the largest in Western Europe to date since the crisis unfolded last September. Critics say French President Nicolas Sarkozy's $33 billion recovery program has favored banks over workers. In Brazil, the 9th World Social Forum continues in the Amazon city of Belém. On Thursday, a panel of Latin American presidents criticized the U.S. for its role in the financial crisis and its double standards in allowing massive state intervention in financial markets. Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa spoke alongside Venezuela's Hugo Chavez, Paraguay's Fernando Lugo, and Bolivia's Evo Morales.
Los culpables de la crisis.
The guilty parties in this crisis try to give lessons on morality and good economic handling. The most powerful people on the planet have united to find a therapy for the dying. They're getting together, the central bankers, the representatives of large financial firms, the people primarily responsible for the crisis.
Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva is also attending the forum, choosing to boycott the gathering of business leaders in Davos, Switzerland. Back in the United States, suicides amongst U.S. troops have increased to a 3-decade high. Pentagon officials say at least 128 soldiers took their own lives last year. The final tally could be higher as more than a dozen other deaths are still under investigation. It's the highest total since record-keeping began in 1980. In Minnesota, jury deliberations have begun in the case of a protester accused of making Molotov cocktails during the Republican National Convention. The case has attracted further scrutiny after it was revealed a key government witness is Brandon Darby, a longtime activist turned FBI informant. The accused protester, David Guy McKay, says he fell victim to entrapment. McKay says Darby came up with the idea for the firebombs and encouraged the activists to make them. And here in New York, activists opposed to the U.S.-backed Israeli assault on Gaza disrupted a gala event last night put on by the lobby group AIPAC. The demonstrators chained themselves together to block 2 entrances at the Marriott Hotel. Police forced them apart by burning off the chains with blowtorches. 10 people were arrested. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Last week, President Obama signed an executive order requiring the closure of Guantanamo Bay Prison within a year.
First executive order that we are signing by the authority vested in me as President by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, in order to effect the appropriate disposition of individuals currently detained by the Department of Defense at Guantanamo, and promptly to close the detention facility at Guantanamo consistent with the national security and foreign policy interests of the United States and the interests of justice, I hereby order. And we then provide the process whereby Guantanamo will be closed no later than 1 year from now.
The president also authorized a task force to review the cases of the 240-odd prisoners currently in Guantanamo and decide where they should be sent. The Pentagon says 100 of the prisoners are considered, quote, too dangerous to be released, but cannot be tried for lack of evidence. Some 80 others could face criminal charges in U.S. courts, and the remaining 60 have already been cleared for release, but cannot be sent home because their own countries would likely harm them. As U.S. lawmakers and European Union countries debate the fate of the prisoners at Guantanamo and where they can be resettled, we turn to a group of prisoners that not only been cleared for release, but also have been reclassified as civilians. These 17 prisoners are no longer considered enemy combatants, but are entering their 7th year in captivity at Guantanamo. They're the Uyghurs, a Muslim ethnic minority group from Western China. I'm joined now by two guests. Alexandra Poulos is a reporter for PBS Frontline World. She joins us here in the Firehouse studio in New York. Her latest report about the Uyghurs, how 22 of them ended up in Guantanamo, how 5 were released in mid-2006 to Albania, and how the remaining 17 continue to languish in detention because no country wants to resettle them. The report's called Getting Out of Gitmo and can be seen in full at pbs.org/Frontline World. Sabin Millet is an attorney for the Uyghurs. He joins us now from Boston. Last week, he sent a letter to Secretary of Defense Robert Gates and Attorney General Designate Eric Holder, urging them to immediately release the Uyghurs and resettle them in the United States. We want to welcome you both to Democracy Now! First of all, Alexandra, how did you learn about this story?
It was a really funny coincidence. I was at my college reunion about 2 years ago, May, and I was sitting next to a friend of mine who was a corporate attorney. And I was sort of teasing him about being a corporate attorney, and he said, "Hey, look, I'm representing Guantanamo detainees." And he started to tell me this story about the Uyghurs, and he said, in fact, just this month, a bunch of them were sent to Albania. And being part Albanian myself, ethnically, I was sort of like, why would anyone send anyone to Albania? How did this happen? So that's how I found out about it.
And who are the Uyghurs?
The Uyghurs of Guantanamo are a Muslim ethnic minority group from China that basically had a circuitous journey that ended up in Afghanistan. Some of them were there to do some sort of ad hoc military training. There was a Uyghur training camp in Afghanistan. I want to emphasize that there was, one AK-47 there. I mean, this was not like a high-level place. Others were economic migrants who ended up in Afghanistan as sort of a way station as they tried to go to overland routes to Turkey. And they got caught up post 9/11. We were bombing Afghanistan. They were fleeing out of their training camp. They crossed the border into Pakistan, and they got turned over by villagers to U.S. forces and sent to Guantanamo.
I want to start right now with an excerpt of the Frontline World report, Getting Out of Gitmo. This is the story of how the Uyghurs ended up at Guantanamo following one of the Uyghurs formerly detained at Guantanamo, now in Albania, Abu Bakr Qasim.
Abu Bakr's big move came in mid-2000. He says he headed out of Xinjiang looking for work. Leaving was bittersweet. His wife was now pregnant. He told her he'd be back in 6 months. But the trip didn't go as planned. From his home in Xinjiang, Abu Bakr headed southwest. Running low on money, he stopped in a Uyghur village in Afghanistan. It was a decision that left him in one of the worst spots in the world after the 9/11 attacks. The U.S. had just begun bombing the al-Qaeda stronghold in Tora Bora, where Abu Bakr had been staying. In the confusion that followed, U.S. forces pursued hundreds of al-Qaeda suspects who fled the bombings. Cash bounties offered by U.S. forces encouraged local villagers to turn in as many people as they could capture. And this is what Abu Bakr and 24 other Uyghurs say happened to them.
If a Pakistani or Afghan villager comes up to you with a guy he has tied up and says, "This is a terrorist, I caught him in my village," what are you going to do? Maybe he is a terrorist.
John Kiriakou was a top CIA official in Pakistan after 9/11. He says the only way to sort out the captives was to send them to Guantanamo.
We viewed it as a place where you had the luxury of time, you had a staff of linguists, and you could spend quality time with each one of these prisoners, interviewing them and getting to the bottom of each one of these stories.
Getting Out of Gitmo excerpt. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We will come back with the reporter and the